What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to first of all take the time to thank you very much for joining me in Black History Month, celebrating the African American fighter. Now, the only reason why I do videos from fighters of the past is because the only way you're going to understand what you're watching currently, or if you're watching fights from the 70s or the 1980s and appreciate it to its fullest degree, you have to understand the past. You have to understand the culture of the fighter who's participating in that event, what they have gone through, the mindset of what they were growing up to be. And that's the reason why I do history. And once you start understanding history, you're going to have a better understanding of your current state. So we're going to have to go back to the 17 and the 1800s and work our way up. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding on the fighters that you're watching. Now, I'm going to be covering African-American fighters. They have a completely different culture. Their mindset is completely different because of what they have gone through in history. Now, all cultures have had their differences and difficulties. In the Jewish community, in the Polish community, in the Hispanic community. But the African-American community has been through a great deal. And there's a lot of struggles. And during the course of this journey, we're going to learn some sickening things, outrageous things that happen to these fighters. The things that they had to have gone through, the things that they have witnessed, they experienced. And hopefully this will be a better understanding to you as to why certain fighters in certain communities have certain thoughts. It's because of what they have gone through. So we're going to take a look at John Banks. He was known as the Darky Wizard. He was born December 25th, 1861 in Richmond, Virginia. He stood 5'6" and he weighed 128 to 140 pounds. Now, he was one of the first African-American middleweights in his prime that dominated his division for many years. He didn't have any training experience in fighting, but he had really good sparring techniques, natural instincts. He had athleticism. He had the ability to think and move and react at the same time. And he started sparring in saloons and clubs in Philadelphia. It was there he was named the Darky Wizard. Now, that might sound cute as a nickname, but it was racially targeted to these fighters. When they would be walking, they would be called, "Come over here, Darky." And that's the mindset that these fighters grew up under. Now, he once had a 23-minute victory over Jimmy Mitchell, because every time Jimmy Mitchell would land on the ground, they would not call it a knockdown. And this happened in 1880. And John Banks was paid $25. And he faced Joe Butler. Joe Butler was a colored middleweight champion. It was a limited match, which means they can stop the fight at any time. This is what some of these fighters had to go through and deal with. Show you how good John Banks was. He faced a former middleweight champion by the name of Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. And he dominated him several times through the course of sparring and fighting. And he did what was called the shuffling of his feet and a cakewalk. Yes, you heard it. John Banks was the creator of the Ali Shuffle and the Jersey Joe Walcott cakewalk. He was an outstanding fighter, was John Banks. Salute to John Banks. Had well over 100 fights. Now let's take a look at Bob Stonewall Allen, who was also known as Lowdown. He was born Atlanta, Georgia, December 10th, 1866. He stood 5'7" and he weighed 100 to 140 pounds. He was managed by Tom O'Rourke. Now, the thing with Bob Allen, very, very good fighter. He fought in Minneapolis and Boston, as well as Minneapolis. And he gambled and he preached. He took a beating in his life only once to Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon. Fought on November 5th, 1892, and April 7th, 1893. May 28th, he fought Andy Watson in Boston, Massachusetts. He also fight fighters such as Sam Langford, fought him April 3rd and April 16th. He won a great deal of his fights, but he was not treated fairly during the course of his career. See, part of an agreement that was made in his behalf. In Boston, he had to stand in a circus between two dummy dolls. And you had people who would pay 5 cents to use a hard baseball, and they would have to try and nail him in the head. But their job was to hit the dummies and win a prize. But he would stand between the two dummies to be hit. Now, he had no choice in this matter because family members were held hostage. That's what happened to Bob Stonewall Allen, nicknamed Lowdown. This is one of the many things that the African-American fighters have experienced during the course of their time. Bob Stonewall Allen, phenomenal fighter. Unfortunately for him, came around on the wrong side of town. Bob Armstrong, an outstanding fighter. Now, he was a sparring partner. He was born September 4th, 1873 in Roxville, Tennessee. He died January 5th, 1933 in Chicago, Illinois. He stood 6'2.5" and he weighed 185 to 217 pounds. He was managed by Charles E. Pearson. His nickname was Pearson and his last name was Davis. Now, the thing with Bob Armstrong, who's an outstanding fighter, a very good sparring partner, and he was in the ring with men such as Tommy Ryan, who would become the middleweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson, who would become the colored heavyweight champion in 1903 when he would defeat Denver Ed Martin, and become the world heavyweight champion in 1908 when he would defeat Tommy Burns. Unbelievable. Stanley Ketchel, who was the middleweight champion of the world. Jim Jeffries, the Boilermaker, who was a heavyweight champion of the world. Bob Fitzsimmons, who was the middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight champion of the world. Sam Langford, who would win the colored middleweight and the colored heavyweight championship belt. The Australian, European, and Mexican heavyweight championship belt. I have Sam Langford as my greatest fighter of all times. Bob Armstrong would also be in the ring with Joe Chowinski, one of the greatest boxers in history. Marvin Hart, who claimed the heavyweight championship belt, but never earned it. Tom Sharkey. This is just a few names that Bob Armstrong would be in the ring with. But he would become the colored heavyweight champion. And he was denied an opportunity to fight for the world championship belt. He was a servant, had to clean horses, had to clean the barnyard. He had to pick vegetables. And yes, he even had to pick cotton. But yet, he would give all the skills that he learned to all these fighters. That's the story of Bob Armstrong. He was a fascinating fighter. But he was not treated in open arms in society. John O'Sullivan wouldn't even spar with him. But he couldn't see being taken advantage of in a ring by an African-American fighter. Ed Binney. He was named the Boston Black. Born April 19th, 1864, Washington, D.C. He stood 5 foot 9 inches and he weighed 154 pounds. He was managed by Tom O'Rourke. Now, Ed Binney was a very good fighter during his day. And the issue with him, now he was fortunate enough to find a gym, George Godfrey's gym. And he had met the colored middleweight champion, Johnny Banks. Now, we talked about him. We didn't go into depth about Johnny Banks. But if you go into Scrapbook Boxing, Johnny Banks, I go through the whole career of Johnny Banks. So what I'm doing basically is just touching on a few fighters until I get to a certain point in boxing careers, and then I'll start going into more depth. But I just want to get you to understand the mindset of the fighters of this time, because they went through struggles. They have gone through a tremendous amount of turmoil because of the color of their skin, because of their language, and because they were athletic and they had the ability to do things naturally. It's just what it was. And for that reason, they were vilified and they were not given opportunities to read. And they were not given opportunities to behave the way they should be allowed to behave. And it's carried all the way up generations. And Ed Binney was another example of what the African-American fighters had to go through. He was involved in battle royales. He was never given opportunities to face the big names, but he was a very good fighter. He traveled to Minneapolis and California. And he fought the Black Pearl, Harry Martin, who was also colored middleweight champion. So I just want to point out a few names to you so you can understand the mindset of the African-American fighters moving forward, what they have gone through. Tom Molyneux and Bill Richmond has gone through. The way they were cheated out of fights. The way they have watched homes burnt in their neighborhood. The way they would sit in the back of a wagon and look up in the tree and see men hung that looked like them. For no explanation at all. That was the mindset of the African-American fighters in the mid-1800s. Thanks for hanging in there with me. This is Scrapbook Boxing. Tune in for the next episode of the African-American experience, the African-American fighter.